We've been in the Gospel of Mark for well over a year now, teaching, preaching, studying our way through this incredible Gospel. We're down now to the last few lessons. We're going to be in Mark chapter 9, if you want to go ahead and turn there in your Bibles. And no, Mark doesn't end in chapter 9, but if you remember, we also just went through a 4-month series on the final week leading to the cross. So we kind of jumped ahead. Now we're backing up. We're going to finish out up through chapter 10. Then we're going to proceed into the book of Acts. And I'm excited to get into that study and look at the establishment of the church, the beginning of the church age, and a lot we're going to take from that. So as we come to Mark chapter 9 this afternoon, there's a couple points I want to bring out for this section, and a couple of other lessons to build off from what Jesus says here, and then we will conclude. So if you've spent time in the Gospels, and you know, as we come to Mark chapter 9, what's coming. You know that Jesus has already been visited on Transfiguration by Moses and Elijah, talking about what was going to happen in Jerusalem. You know what's coming. The cross is coming. Jesus knows. He's told the apostles, and yet it's not sinking in for anyone of what's coming, because they can't see past their own desires and ambitions of what the Messiah was supposed to do. So in these final couple of months before the cross, Jesus' public ministry at this point is over. It's done. No more public ministry. There'll be offshoots of when things coincide, when they line out the way they do, and you'll see some small things happen. But Jesus' primary focus now is on the apostles. He is teaching them because they're the torchbearers that are going to pick up the cross very soon and continue on with it. And so what Jesus does now, and it's really incredible the way he does it, Jesus was the most masterful teacher. And so what he does is he's getting this one-on-one time with the apostles, breaking away from crowds, focusing on them. He starts the lesson on faith. Mark 9 begins with lessons of faith. In fact, verse 27 through 30, Jesus emphasizes faith above everything else. It always begins with faith. Eternal life begins with faith. So Jesus begins here with faith. He concludes chapter 10 with faith again. And he bookends this lessons. Now, in this, we're going to find some struggles here with walking by faith. What does it mean? Now, if you remember back to about a month and a half ago, last time we were in the Gospel of Mark, and then we went up into a series of lessons separate from Mark. But if you remember back, the last lesson we had was on a man, a father, and his boy who was demon-possessed. The demon was just throwing the boy down, making him convulse, throw him into fire, throw him into the water. But it's the interaction between the Father and Jesus that really sets the stage for this. Jesus tells the man, if you believe, all things are possible. The Father replied with this phrase. It is one of the rawest, just most real statements of somebody struggling in faith. He says, I do believe, help my unbelief. So faith is the launching point from this, but where do you go if you're going to have this myriad of lessons? Where do you go from faith? And we'll see some of these in the coming weeks, but the Lord immediately jumps to one of the most important virtues of any Christian. And yet it's so hard to accept that we tend to just kind of gloss over it. And so he goes into the importance of humility. Now let's think logically for just a moment. All right? Before we dive into this, I want you to think about this. Why go to humility? Why first go to humility? Does Jesus get a sense of something with the apostles? Does he get a sense of something within us all? Of course he does, before he ever asked the question. But what I want you to see is this. Humility is such a foreign concept to the natural-minded person because people are taught from childhood, even as toddlers, that life revolves around you. If you didn't know this, the earth no longer rotates around the sun, it rotates around us. We decide what happens. Everything is about us. Life is about us. You put yourself first. Anything outside of that just doesn't make sense. But the very foundation of being a Christian is the call to humility. Micah 6:8 says, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. It's easy to say, but the truth is, it remains one of the hardest lessons we'll learn. Do you know why? I almost found humor in this, and I don't mean to, but I joke about this, and I need to be careful on how I joke about it. When I say, I'll tell people all the time, I'm one of the most humble people you'll ever meet. Which I say that jokingly. I'm not saying that to be serious. But the problem with humility is, as soon as you start to think you have it, you've lost it. Once you start thinking you're humble, you've lost it. That's the power. That's why there's this challenge in humility to understand where the priorities are. And you think about one of the last things Jesus did in the upper room before you get into the John 14 through 17 prayer discourse. You get into the Garden of Gethsemane, you get to Jerusalem, Calvary. Before that, he's in the upper room with the apostles, and one of the last things he does is wash their dirty feet. And if the greatest could humble himself, well then, who are we not to? So to make the point here, Jesus has some examples. He's going to begin with the greatest showing of humility ever recorded, because he goes immediately to talking about his own crucifixion. And so I will begin in Mark chapter 9 by seeing humility in example. We're going to begin in verse 30. The goal is to try to make our way down to verse 40 today. Verse 30. Then they departed from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know. Hold up there for just a second. We're going to take these verse at a time, because there's just so much to unpack. We've been away from it now for a month and a half, so there's some things I want you to remember. Jesus and his disciples at this point are making their way back down from Caesarea Philippi, where they've been up in the northern band up above Galilee near Mount Hermon, likely where Transfiguration took place. But the journey now is headed back south. Jesus is going to make his way into Judea. He's going to Jerusalem, all the way to Golgotha and the grave. But on the way, verse 33, he stops in Capernaum. He doesn't want anybody to know it. Now, I would ask the obvious question, why be secret about it? Why have the secrecy? Because the public ministry is over. His public ministry in Galilee is over. He says it. I mean, they've had more than enough. They saw more than enough. They heard more than enough. That's why we get sayings like, if Sodom and Gomorrah would have heard the things you heard, saw the things you heard, they would have repented. But the people in Galilee wouldn't do it. Now again, there'll be some exceptions to this. There'll be, especially once you get into Judea, there'll be some smaller lessons. But the public ministry is over. Mark jumps right from this into the entrance into Jerusalem, but Galilee has made their decision. So, they're making their way back south. Now, here's Jesus explaining this to them. For he, Christ, taught his disciples and said to them, this is his lesson to them. The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. After he is killed, he will rise again on the third day. To be clear, this has been the message since Mark chapter 8. Back several months ago, we got to Mark 8. This was the theme, and yet the problem persists because the disciples don't get it. It doesn't fit the context of the Messiah to be a dead Messiah. That's not what they thought. That's why Paul calls this a stumbling block to the Jews, because a crucified Messiah makes no sense. A Messiah who would attack the Jewish religious system instead of attacking Rome makes no sense. And it's not just that Jesus is going to be killed here. The more shocking in this is that the Son of Man will be betrayed. Other translations will use the word delivered. It's the paradidomai. It means to be handed over. It's a technical term, delivered. You're being delivered to someone. Of course, a fun study would be, and we don't have time for this afternoon, a fun study would be to try to figure out who's guilty of that, who really delivered Jesus over to be killed, to be crucified, like who's really guilty of the cross. I mean, because we would immediately jump on the bandwagon of Judas the betrayer did it, or the Sanhedrin and their ridiculous trials they had, Pilate, Herod. We go through all of these different things, but we stop and miss the point. Of course, we could throw ourselves in the list too. But to stop there is to miss the whole point, because Peter says something in Acts chapter 2, and I'm really excited to get to this. in about the next 2 months, Lord willing. But he gives them the answer because he talks about Jesus being delivered over, Acts 2:23. Him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. So all this is happening because of God's plan, God's determined purpose. But the idea of the crucifixion seems so foreign, the last part really had to throw him. He said, I'm going to rise again 3 days later. Of course, that just kind of flies over their head. We know it flies over their head because of this. They didn't understand the saying. Not only did they not understand the saying, they were afraid to ask him. To be fair, this would be a lot to take in. We have the luxury of having the Bible, and we've studied it. So we understand it. But could you imagine walking down the road and hear this? Do you think this would have just, oh, I get it now. It all makes sense. No, this is easy to comprehend. And you think with the resurrection, it kind of makes sense because they've seen Jesus resurrect people before. Seeing someone raised from the dead is not new. It's within his power, but that's when Jesus is alive. Who's going to do it when Jesus is dead? So it's semi-believable to live in Christ. But there's something else going on here, and this is where I really want to make sure we look at least a little bit. Luke 9 records another aspect of this. He's helping us put the full story together here. Listen to what Luke records. But they did not understand the saying. Mark already said that. We're good. But listen to this. And it was hidden from them, so that they did not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him. So that's, and I'm trying to be careful, I don't want to get too much into this. That's the word parklupto. So that word means something was acted upon to conceal. There's something acting on you, concealing you from you. You think about somebody walking up behind you, they put their hands over your head, and now you can't see. Something blocked you from being able to see it. Now the question would be, why would the Lord conceal anyone from being able to see this, to understand this? Why? You see, the concealment is not due to God's design. It's due to the limitations of man. By that I mean, the Lord concealed the fullness of what's about to happen because they couldn't comprehend it. They could not take it in and handle it. So Jesus protected them so that they were not completely devastated by what they were about to hear. And so instead, he gives them a picture of humility, an example, himself being crucified on the cross. But now he shifts to the thought of humility. He keeps going, humility and thought. Then he came to Capernaum. So they've made their way back south. They're now in Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what was it you disputed among yourselves on the road? Now, have you ever noticed Jesus keeps asking questions like this? He's God. Doesn't he already know the answer? Yes. But it's a great method of teaching. Jesus is a masterful teacher. He asks the question when he wants you to answer that question for yourself. The Lord already knew the answer. The point is you have to admit it in your heart. And guess what? They didn't want to. In fact, look at verse 34. But they kept silent. They didn't want to answer. Because we get this parenthetical statement. For on the road they had disputed amongst themselves who's the greatest. You wouldn't want to tell Jesus that. Well, Jesus, hey, while you're talking about the fact that you're going to be killed and betrayed, we were arguing on who's going to be the greatest. You wouldn't want to admit that either. It's an ugly discussion to have, period. Amongst yourselves, why Jesus is talking about the crucifixion. It's one thing to think you're greater than everybody else. And even then, that's still wrong. But do you know the arrogance to actually dispute it out loud who's going to be the greatest? Think about it. Do you know what this would be like? Here in this congregation, our Cottondale Church of Christ, we have 3 elders. That would be like us going to 3 elders and saying, hey, all right, y'all go in this room and y'all figure out the hierarchy. Who's going to be the greatest? Who's going to be the least? Y'all figure it out. That's not how it works. That's not the purpose. That's not what's supposed to happen. They're outright arguing over who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. So why do they need this lesson here in Capernaum? Because they're battling with the same desires of human pride that we do today. They're waiting on Christ to enter into His glory. They're going to stroll right in with Him. Of course, Peter, he wants to be first behind Jesus. And yet you learn the plurality of this. It's not just Peter saying he wants to be the greatest, or James or John, the sons of thunder. It's not just them. It's all of them arguing over this. That idea of being seen as powerful and righteous. I guess they just forgot about the whole take up your cross thing. Again, they didn't grow up with the Bible in their hand. They didn't grow up with Jesus. They've had a ministry of 3 years. And again, this thought of humility is not natural. So they grew up watching the Pharisees. That's their example. Now, do you think the Pharisees are pictures of humility? Nobody thinks that? Okay, fair enough. You tell me if you think this is humble or not, okay? I'm going to wear a big phylactery box. And I'm going to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and more ornate so that it looks very grand and that I have my scripture in them. And I just look very, very ornate, so that's what I can use to it. Or I'm going to have my robe and my long tassels on them. And when I get ready to give my collection, see, you gave a collection this morning. But when I give my collection as a Pharisee, I'm going to have somebody come through and ring bells so that you see the grand offer I'm going to give, or blow trumpets, so that just to get your attention, just so you can see. And then as a Pharisee, when I fast, I'm going to put ashes on my head, and I'm going to sit out in the street and just look completely demoralized and broken down, so that you know how holy I am because I'm fasting. That's my image. And when I pray, it's going to be long and repetitious, so that when you see me as a Pharisee, you think, wow, look how holy he is. That was the apostles' model. That was the best of religion they knew. And so I wonder what the apostles think about themselves now, since they are the religious ones. They have been personally chosen by the Messiah, and yet humility is nowhere near the top of their list. Instead, they're arguing about who is going to be the greatest amongst them. It's their turn. But understand what pride does. All right, what pride does, amongst the 12 especially, but what it does. Pride divides. Pride prevents unity. Pride creates rifts amongst people. And the sad thing is they knew it was wrong. If you don't think it's wrong, why not answer Jesus when he asked the question? You know it's wrong. You catch your kids doing something they're not supposed to be doing. Like, what did you just say? Nothing. Why not just give you the answer? Because they know it was wrong. The Lord just finished telling them about his own humiliation. But do you think that sank in for them when all they could think about is their own pride and exaltation? Now, this is more of a book study. We're learning exactly what happened, but don't miss how important this is for the church. Because pride is disruptive, dismissive, critical, judgmental. It demeans, it belittles. It's poison. What's Saban's favorite saying? Rat poison. And even though Jesus asked the question, he knows this. And so he's going to give them another example. And now he's going to put into picture what he's been trying to teach them so that they should understand it. So now we get humility in illustration. So he sat down. He called the 12, verse 35, and he said to them this phrase. Listen how backwards this sounds. If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Now, sitting down was a normal rabbinical teaching. It's pretty interesting to read about the teacher sitting and everyone else standing. So I've got a bench over here if y'all want to try this out. Anybody want to stand and let me sit for a while? Okay, you're pretty shook his head. No, pretty good. Okay, all right. Well, it's worth a shot. You don't know if you don't ask. But he sits down, he's teaching, and then he hits them with this truth. All right? It's like a riddle. You want to be first? You want to be the greatest? You want glory and exaltation? All those things you're thinking in your heart, and they all want the same thing. Okay, you want that, then you have to be last. You want to be first, you have to be last. Well, hang on, Jesus, you lost me on this. What do you mean if I want to be first, I have to be last? Because striving to be first means I'm trying to get ahead of everybody else. And now you're telling me it's the opposite. have to be behind everybody else. If you're willing to be last, then you understand the importance of something bigger than you. So what is it? So Jesus gives them this illustration, just so they can see it. Verse 36. Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Now, this young child just kind of appears in the account. We don't know how old he is. I don't even know where he came from. But he's old enough to be kind of there standing beside Jesus, small enough to be in the Lord's arms. But by the way, when you hear this, how jealous are you about this little boy that Jesus just takes and puts him in his arms? Just an incredible place to be. But Jesus would teach with illustrations and parables, right? And so he's acting out this parable for them. He says, true greatness, all right, this is your goal. True greatness is not about power, position, and honor. It's not about what the world says power is. Greatness is. Instead, it's the opposite. It's childlike innocence. Traits they understand, that kids understand and adults forget. Trustfulness, lack of prejudice, loving kindness, faith, humility. A child has no power, no greatness. They're weak, they're vulnerable. They have nothing to offer except trustfulness, lack of prejudice, loving kindness, faith, and humility. It's a perfect illustration for a Christian. And it's in the example that Jesus says, if you receive a child like this. Now he's shifting from physical to spiritual. It's not about just, if I go back and pick up Liam and I received a little child, I've done what Jesus said. That's not what it's about. He shifts to spiritual. If you receive a spiritual child like this, one who receives them, you don't just receive me, Christ says, you receive the Father who sent me. When a believer comes and you receive them, and how you treat them, it's representative of how you treat Christ and how you receive Christ. Now, think about that in the context of what the apostles were doing, arguing over who's the greatest, who's the most prominent, arguing over who's going to have the most authority, stepping all over each other in the process, instead of opening their arms to become a servant to each other, leading to the serious problem of pride, and pride equals destruction. In fact, the Bible says pride goes before the fall. Pride forfeits honor. Pride rejects the Lord. Pride glorifies self. And that's what we find when we do in the next verse. It's all about self. So notice how far the apostles had taken this. So we jump past the illustration, right? And now you get John chiming in. Why is John chiming in? And why is it recorded right after he says this? It's about how you receive people. So listen to what John says as he just kind of jumps in the conversation here. Now John answered him. So this is John's response to Jesus' illustration. Now John answered him saying, Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us, casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow us. So John's, whether it's his conscience is starting to get the best of him, or he remembers this, he remembers back to this event that's happened sometime in the past. He sees that not only are they competing amongst themselves for glory, that you can't have someone outside the group achieve such a feat as this, because that takes away from themselves. So the apostles saw this. They saw someone doing a good thing in the Lord's name, and he shut it down. No, cannot have this. Why? And by the way, this person is not being described with words like sorcerer. None of these words we find in the Bible to talk about any kind of false, fake thing. Not a phony. They were just saying he had literally done this. A true follower of Jesus, a believer of Jesus, and yet we know nothing about him. I don't know where he came from. I don't know how he heard about Jesus, how he came to faith. I don't know what he was able to do in the name of Jesus. I don't know. Now we do know in Luke 10 that John gave power to cast out demons to the 70. Was he one of the 70? I don't know. The report back to Jesus didn't say who he was. It just says, we saw him and we stopped. We shut it down. Because he wasn't part of our inner group and we couldn't receive him, so we stopped it. Jesus once again has to reply. You would think at some point they start getting this. Here's what he says. But Jesus said. You know how many times we've read that? But Jesus said, but Jesus did. Jesus is having to just constantly rebuke them and rebuttal what they're saying and doing. But Jesus said, do not forbid him. For no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterwards speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is on our side. Now this verse makes a major point abundantly clear. It is not so much part of this lesson. How many sides did he say there are? There's two. He who is not against us, side one, is on our side, side two. Which means you're either on Jesus' side or you're not on Jesus' side. That's the only two options. You're for him or you're against him. There's no fence setting, middle of the road, none of that. There's no plan 3, option C, none of that. There's two sides. But he's saying, look, you don't stop someone. It's not about competition. By the way, do you understand we're not racing each other to heaven? You know, me and Cliff are in a race with each other, and look, you know, even though he's quite a bit older than me, I'm not going to get into how much older, but even though he's quite a bit older than me, he's smaller. He's got size to his advantage. So I'm probably going to trip him and throw a knee out, and I'm going to stroll right into heaven while he's rolled on the ground. We're not racing each other to heaven. I hope we're all on the same narrow road going to heaven. That's the hope. That's the goal. So what sense does it make to try to trip someone else up so that I can get there first? When we should be celebrating whatever someone else has to offer in the kingdom. Because it's all being done, hopefully, to the glory of God. I'm going to stop at verse 40 today. Lord willing, we'll pick up here next week. But as we close, I want you to think about this. There's a reason the Bible says pride goes before the fall. Pride is one of the most destructive attributes within a person. It's that desire to be first, even at the expense of everything else and everyone else. And how many people do you know just like that? That are just filled with pride, and yet they never are satisfied in what they desire, what they're after. I mean, it's that natural worldly mindset, and yet there never seems to be satisfaction in it. But to be in Christ is to understand it's not about being first. It's about humbling yourself because God is first. And we humble ourselves to Him as Jesus did. Jesus humbled Himself in taking on the cross. And so I want you to think about this. Is our goal today to be first or to be faithful? Be first or be faithful. When you're first, you put yourself above everything else. When you're faithful, you put the Lord above everything else. And then the natural result of putting the Lord above everything else is you realize how quickly you start drifting down the line, and that's fine. It doesn't matter. Because that tells you where your priorities are. That's where the goal is, the prize we're running towards. And it's something so contrary to a dying world. So I want you to think about that question as we get ready to leave here this afternoon. I want you to reflect upon that in your walk. Is your goal to be first? And I put last, and I really wish I would change that. Is your goal to be first or last? And again, I really wish I made it say, is your goal to be first or is your goal to be faithful? If your goal is to be faithful, then the rest will work itself out naturally. So I want you to think about that question as we close here. We're going to have another invitation song. Brother Marshall's going to come lead us in that. And again, we'll never end a service here without extending that off, that invitation, should someone have the need this afternoon. And I know Dupree's good to always mention that. The invitation's never closed. It's always open. But we're going to have this song. And if you're reflecting upon this about pride and humility, where you've placed yourself in the kingdom, are you trying to be first or you're trying to be last, and you realize there's a need, whether you're one that needs to answer the gospel call or you're one that needs prayers or need encouragement, you haven't been living faithfully in your walk, and pride's been more of a common theme of your life, then as the church, we would love to help you in any way, pray for you, encourage you. whatever you need today. So if we can help you in any way as Marshall comes and leads us in the song, I want to encourage you to come as we'll stand together and we sing the song.
Have thine enough faith.